Go ahead and turn your Bibles to John chapter 9. Back in our exposition through the Gospel of John in chapter 9 this afternoon. Go ahead and ask the Lord for His help, and then we'll look at our passage together. Lord, we thank you for the great privilege that it is to know you and to worship you together as your people. Lord, we come now to your word. We ask that you would please give us eyes to see and ears to hear. Give us faith to believe all that you have for us in your word. We pray that you would reveal Christ to us, that we would see him and go to him in faith. Lord, I pray that this text would honor you, that you would give me a conviction of the text and help me to faithfully convey it to your people. We just ask for your help during this time. Go ahead and read John chapter 9, and as we move into chapter 9 this week, you'll notice that all of chapter 9 revolves around this one event. It's one big narrative in chapter 9. It's not split up into different events going on. Here we're going to read Jesus heals this man that's born blind, and the rest of chapter 9, because we're going to look at verse 1 through 7 this afternoon, just 1 through 7. And the rest of chapter 9 is all the reaction to this miracle, all the ways that the Pharisees and this man's parents and the man himself all react to it, and it's all the same situation going on. So we're just going to look at 1 through 7 this afternoon, looking closely at the miracle itself, and then next week, the rest of the chapter, looking at the events in the larger context of this miracle. So we'll read starting in verse 1. As he passed by, that is Jesus here, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was not this man's sin or his parents, but the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Well, we see here in verse 1, Jesus passes by, he's walking by with his disciples, and he sees a blind man. The disciples notice this blind man as well, probably because Jesus sees this blind man who he intended to go to perform this miracle. The disciples take notice of Jesus looking at this man, and of course we see the question the disciples raise, but I want you to notice just at the very beginning here, the play on words, where it says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. Jesus is walking by, and he sees a man who cannot see him. He sees a man who cannot see him. Jesus takes notice of this blind beggar who would have never known that Jesus was there if Jesus would have just walked on by and not stopped and dealt with this man. Jesus notices this blind man who never would have saw him or knew he was there if Jesus would not have stopped and noticed him. Number one here, I want you to look at how compassionate and how kind this shows our Lord to be. This is one of those little things that you see in the Gospels, one of those little small phrases talking about Jesus and his compassion that just sort of endears your heart to him as a Christian. You see how Jesus is walking by and he notices a man who would have had no idea that he was there. Jesus takes notice of one who would have never noticed him. Secondly here, in order to see Jesus, he has to first see us. I'm kind of jumping right into things here, but the text is pretty straightforward in terms of what's going on. There's nothing here that's complex to us, really. It's very straightforward narrative. But notice that in order to see Jesus, he has to see us first. He has to see us first. Jesus literally sought out this blind man. This man, as we note here in the passage, was not looking for Jesus. He was not crying out for Jesus, asking for someone to take him to Jesus, asking for directions, or asking where he was, or asking someone to go get Jesus. This man is just there, a blind man, probably sitting wherever he sat, begging. And Jesus seeks him out. Jesus goes to him without the man asking for it or seeking him out. Indeed, the man himself had no sight to even see Jesus with. He had no vision. He had no ability. He had no idea what Jesus looked like. Who knows if he'd heard of Jesus? It's likely he did, but also maybe he hasn't. We don't know. But he had no sight to see, no vision, no ability, and he wasn't even trying to find Jesus, to be brought to him. Not even asking Jesus to be healed. As if he sort of assumes, as a man born blind, that this is his plight. This is his destiny. It's just to be a blind man for his entire life. Maybe not even ever thinking about the possibility that he might one day see. And yet Jesus, this is the type of person that Jesus sought out here. Jesus sought him out. He saw him. He looked upon him. And it is fitting that this is where we start in verse 1, because this is where everything starts for us as Christians. It starts here with Jesus seeing us first, with Jesus looking upon us with his eye of compassion and mercy, observing us in our helpless estate, unable to even see ourselves for who we are. We're so blind we can't even see ourselves for the sinners that we are. We know nothing, as this man did. We know nothing but blindness, nothing but the darkness, not knowing what it is that we are missing, or what it is that we're not seeing. And I hope that you can see yourself here as the blind beggar here. Helpless, hopeless, clueless, until Jesus looked upon you, set his eyes upon you. Certainly Jesus did not look upon this man because he was some really magnificent sight to be seen. He was a blind man with nothing lovely about his appearance, nothing worth going to look upon. He was a very probably lowly, simple, not attractive-looking blind man, and nothing to cause anybody's eye to turn upon him except maybe an eye of awkwardness or uncomfortableness, not an eye of pleasure to look upon him. And yet, Jesus looks upon such a man, not because there was anything lovely about his appearance, because the loveliness of a man or a woman is not why Jesus sets his eyes of saving grace upon a man or a woman. Because if that were the case, then no one would ever have Jesus look upon them with saving grace, or look upon them with compassion and love. Because we are, in the eyes of a holy and just and pure and perfect God, dust, worms, sinners, rebels, nothing worthy to be looked upon, especially in comparison to the loveliness and the infinite beauty of Christ. We are nothing to be looked upon. But Jesus, this is part of what makes him so lovely in himself, that Jesus looks upon such unlovely people, such undesirable, and such type of people that no one wants to set their eyes upon. Jesus looks upon such an unlovely people, so much so that the angels scratch their heads in mystery at what Jesus is doing with such rebel creatures as us. And this is part of the loveliness of Christ, is that he in all his loveliness looks upon the unloveliness of people like us. And he does so such that the works of God might be displayed, as he says, in his saving and transforming of such a ones. He takes the most unlovely and outcast and lowly people, and he transforms them into the type of people. He makes them beautiful. He sanctifies them. He washes them in the water of the Word and presents them as pure and spotless before his Father. Jesus looks upon us with love, not because we are lovely, but because he is lovely himself. And it is lovely that the loveliest of them all would look upon such unlovely ones as us, and like a blind man in whom we ought to see ourselves. That's so often how it is. That's how we treat people. When we see someone with a strange disability, or a person with some kind of sickness or disability or blindness, we sort of, as people, are tempted to kind of walk around them, or kind of stay away, or feel awkward around them. And yet Jesus reacts nothing like that at all, with such truly wretched rebels as we are. So meanwhile, as Jesus looks upon this man and approaches him, and of course knows what he's about to do for this man and teach his disciples and the trouble he's about to cause, meanwhile the disciples, they're looking upon this man, and quite a different perspective they have than Jesus has. They immediately assume that this man is in his blind condition as a judgment for sin, either sin that he committed or sin that his parents committed, and thus he's being judged for it by the blindness, since he was a man born blind. And Jesus responds, and he tells them that it's not for his sin or his parents' sin that he was born blind. But I do want you to notice here that Jesus, when the disciples ask this question, Jesus doesn't, rebuke them for asking such a question. He simply says, no, it's neither of those things, except the works of God might be displayed in him. But he doesn't rebuke them for asking that question, or for thinking that necessarily. The way that the disciples asked the question shows us that this was sort of the common belief of that day, that being born with some kind of disability was a sign of some sin that you or your parents committed. And so that's why you were born with such a sin. Now Jesus says here, no, that's not the case. That's not the case. It seems that, Jesus is saying that, of course, he says that he doesn't say that it's never the case, that someone's has a disability or something because of judgment for sin. He doesn't say that's never the case, but he does say that it's not always the case, and likely implying here we should not assume that that is the case. But he doesn't say that it's never the case, and it seems that as we think about this idea here, in our modern day, we have sort of overreacted to say that our afflictions are never God's judgments for sin. And I would say that's probably a bit of an overreaction, to say that our afflictions are never judgments for our sin, or consequences of our sin. You might recall that in our catechism, it states, I can't remember the question, but it states that, I think it's in the question about, does God judge the wicked or the ungodly? He says, the answer to that is that it states that God judges sinners both in this life and in the life to come. And so there are real earthly judgments for sin. I think we see this in the Bible in many places. There are real earthly judgments for sin, not just reserved for eternity. There are real earthly judgments for sin. And certainly, in one sense, all imperfections in this world are a result of the fall. Generally speaking, they're a result of sin, generally speaking, as a consequence of the fall. But that is not at all to say that all defects or all afflictions are judgments for a specific sin that an individual committed. That is certainly not the case. Jesus rejects that idea here. It's not the case that all judgments or afflictions are a direct consequence of that sin or a sin. And I certainly think Jesus is saying that we ought not to assume that someone born with a disability of some kind bore that because of sin. I think that's what Jesus is teaching here. We ought not to assume that. So Jesus says it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Now, what a radically different purpose Jesus ascribes to this situation than what man ascribed to it, than what the disciples or the common thought of the day ascribed to it. They just assumed, well, this man has sinned, or his parents, and so this is why he's this way. But Jesus comes along and says, no, it is because God is going to display his work in this man, and he was born this way. It's a very radically different perspective to the same situation, going from judgment of sin, this man's under judgment of sin, to being made for the purpose that the works of God will be displayed in this man. That's quite an upgrade for this man. And one of the things I think we see here is that man is naturally cynical or suspicious or pessimistic. But Jesus comes along and he knows the power and the purposes of God, and he knows what God has sent him to do and how God has desired to save, and he sent his Son of the world to save the world. And Jesus is rather optimistic in this scenario. He looks upon weakness as an opportunity for divine power to be displayed, instead of looking upon the weakness as a consequence of sin. Jesus here, he sees a helpless man as actually a very hopeful situation. And I believe that if Christians remembered the power of God, if we remember the power of God, if we knew just a little bit of what God was doing and what he was working in the world, then we, kind of like Jesus, could be able to look upon the darkest of times, the most difficult of seasons, with a true, hopeful, faith-filled outlook. Knowing that God is doing something. God is working something for his glory and for our good. And he's not just letting things go to ruin, but God is doing something in history. And that should give us an optimism. That God is using the worst of things for his purposes and displaying his redemptive works. Jesus teaches here, when he teaches that, no, this man was not born blind because of his sin, because of his parents' sin, but rather that God's works will be displayed in him. This teaching here, we also need to take into account, it's a teaching that brings a fatal blow to the health and wealth, prosperity gospel today. You know, the health and wealth gospel will say that if you're sick or you're disabled, it's because there's some sin in your life, because you don't have enough faith, or there's something lacking, or you just need to sow your seed of faith. You've got to believe God, and he'll heal you. And Jesus here is plainly rejecting any idea of that. It's a plain rejection of such a foolish teaching. And what we learn here is that if you are disabled, it is because God purposes to show the power of his works in you in some way or another. And what an honorable privilege that now becomes for you. Instead of looking upon whatever physical ailments you might have as some negative thing in your life, you can now look on it in Christ as an opportunity for the work of God to be displayed in your life, as an opportunity for God to be glorified in your situation. You can truly look on it and see that you are chosen, if you have some sort of disability like this, whatever affliction it is that you have, that God has chosen you to be afflicted so that he could display his work in you, and that he might be glorified in your affliction. Now, of course, For this man, God's purposes was to actually heal him, work a miracle in his physical body, to display his power in that specific way. But we know that that is not always how God desires to display his power in our weakness or our physical ailments. That's not always how God likes to display his works in us. We have to be aware of that. That when we say that the reason for our physical afflictions is that God's power would be displayed in us, that doesn't mean that it's a promise that he's going to do that by healing. But there are thousands of other ways that God's power can be displayed in your afflictions without healing physically of that thing. There are a million other ways that can happen. It might be just as simple as the faithful witness of a Christian living with whatever affliction it is for their entire life. To remain faithful, to trust God, and to not have a lifelong pity party, but to joyfully, triumphantly take whatever it is that God afflicts them with, believing it's for their good. That, it might just be as simple as that. But there are a million other ways that God might desire to display his power in whatever affliction it is that he's given to you. This is sort of God's way. This is one of his ways of curse reversing. It's one of his redemptive themes that he reveals to us. He takes what is a curse and he makes it a blessing. So when you have something that's a result of the fall, not necessarily a punishment for your own sin, but some kind of disability that happens because sin has entered and broken the world, and God uses that cursed thing as a blessing, as a display of his power and glory in your life, you are kind of participating in God's curse reversing in your life. And on the other hand of things, we know that we've just been talking about, from a physical perspective here, how God works through these means of affliction. But on the other hand, we know that spiritually all humans are indeed born blind from birth, and it actually is due to sin and their parents' sin. All humans are born spiritually blind from birth because of their sin and the sin of their parents. Because in Adam, our first father, our first parent, we sinned. We fell in Adam. We sinned in him. So for his scars, we were born blind as this man, although this man was because of his parents' sin physically, but there is a spiritual reality that yes, we are born blind because of our sin and the sin of our first parent. And this is a blindness that is of much greater significance and importance than a physical blindness. It's a blindness that is of much more serious consequence than a physical blindness. It is not the type of blindness that we can learn how to adapt and live life and afford to never be healed of. It's not a blindness we can afford to ever be healed of. We need a new set of eyes. You see, Jesus, when he heals the blind man, one of the aspects of it is that it is a display of his light. It's a display of his light. Jesus said in verse 5, he says that he's the light of the world, and the night is coming. Now, just a quick note here, I think what Jesus is talking about in verse 4 and 5, the night was coming, it's a reference to him leaving the world, that he will not always be in the world physically. As Jesus says, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, Jesus is not saying there that he's going to stop being the light of the world and stop shedding his light abroad on sinners and opening their eyes once he ascends into heaven. But he's just making the point that there's going to come a time when his earthly ministry is going to end and he won't be here physically anymore. And so while he is here, now is the time to do the works that he was set out to do. Because soon a time is coming when He's going to have to do the great and ultimate work of dying and suffering on the cross, and then rising again and ascending into heaven. So when Jesus here, he gives the blind man his sight, Jesus is showing himself to be the light of the world, as he literally, for this guy, brings light into darkness. So this guy, born blind, he knew absolutely nothing except the darkness of sight, or the lack of sight, we could say. And Jesus comes along, and he says, I'm the light of the world. And for the first time in this blind man's life, he can see. There's now light in his eyes. Jesus is the light, truly, that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has been overcome. Verse 6, it says, having said these things, Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. He said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So what's the deal here with Jesus spitting in the dirt to make mud and applying it to the man's eyes and having him wash in the pool? What's the point of all this? Well, the use of dirt here, it might cause us, it ought to cause us to think of several different things. And one way to see this is as a work of recreation, or a new creation work, where we are playing off of the Genesis account here, where God, he makes man from the dust, he forms Adam from the dust of the earth, and he breathes life into it with his mouth. Jesus is sort of playing off of that theme where the Jews would have known and believed that only God is the creator of life. Only God can give life and take life. God is alone the creator of all things. That was their worldview, rightly so. And Jesus here comes along and he is making a new creation, so to speak. He is making sight where there is no sight. And he is thus showing himself to be creator. Thus, showing himself to be God. The fact that Jesus shows himself to be a creator means he is showing himself to be God, because only God is creator. So this miracle is a sign that Jesus is God, which is, of course, one of the great themes we've been talking about, the deity of Christ, and how the Jewish people revolted against that. And Jesus, again, by this sign of this work of new creation, so to speak, he's showing himself to be creator God. You see, there was a man, Adam, made from the dirt, in whom we all sinned. And we all feel the effects of that sin. But Jesus then, he comes along here in John chapter 9, and he spits on that dirt, sort of a condemning act, if you will. He's sort of condemning the dirt that rebelled against himself. He spits on it, condemns the dirt, and he picks it up where he spit on it, and he redeems it. He takes the condemnation in his hand, and he redeems it and makes a new creation. Sort of just like at the creation in Genesis, there was nothing but darkness. There was no light. Nothing but darkness for this blind man the same way, up until Jesus said, let there be light. And this as well kind of plays off John's theme of the new birth and regeneration that we see in his gospel here. You see, we don't just need to be born once. We don't just need to be made of dirt one time, but we need to be made again. We need to be made new. We need to be remade. And so Jesus, he made us with dirt once, and here he's sort of in a picture. He takes dirt again, and he baptizes it, if you will, in his saliva, and he makes a new set of eyes. He makes a new set of eyes. Where the eyes were blinded in the darkness of sin, he makes a new set of eyes. Jesus mixes his saliva with the dirt. So again, we were made with dirt. We need to be remade again. The dirt's not enough. So Jesus washes us, so to speak, in his saliva, in the water of regeneration, and makes us into a new creation. breathing in, out of his mouth, breathing life into the new dirt. There's also another way that we can think about this use of saliva and mud. And that is that it could cause us to think about how Jesus cleanses the unclean. Jesus cleanses the unclean. Think about it here. The saliva and the mud are dirty things. They are unclean things. And Jesus, he takes the unclean and he makes it clean. He cleanses the man's eyes with the dirt and saliva mixed together. Still yet, there's another thought here for our consideration as to why Jesus would put mud on this man's eyes when he was already blind. Why did Jesus put mud on the man's eyes when he was already blind? And we know the mud did not heal. The mud itself doesn't heal the man. That's not what made this man see, putting mud on his eyes. But by putting mud on the man's eyes, Jesus is showing us how easy it is for him to make blind men see. It's as easy as wiping mud off your eyes. It's like for Jesus, all this man has is a little dirt in his eyes he's got to wash off. So that's kind of the idea of Jesus here. He's not, for us, it's impossible. This man is born with blind from birth. It's not something he can wash off his skin. But for Jesus, it's so easy, it's like washing dirt off the skin. Jesus is showing us how easy it is for him to make blind men see. It's like wiping mud off your eyes. It's as easy as spitting in the dirt. What is absolutely impossible for man, there's no problem with Jesus. Born blind, no problem. Putting mud over a blind man's eyes as well could easily be seen as a bit of mockery. Okay, you're sort of, it is a blind man, you take mud, you're putting it on his eyes, you're sort of mocking his blindness because he obviously can't even see the mud directly on his eyes. Easily it could have been seen as making fun of the blind man, mocking him. He can't even see there's mud on his eyes. The mud in his eyes kind of shows, it's a symbol of his blindness. And if you couldn't see now, he definitely can't see with mud on his eyes. But we know Jesus certainly is not mocking this man. He's not making fun of this poor blind man. He's not playing a cruel joke on this man. But Jesus is not mocking the man, but he is mocking the blindness. He's not mocking the man, but he is mocking the blindness. He's mocking the enemy, is what he's doing. He's mocking death when he mocks the blindness, as the apostle does when he says, "O death, where is thy sting? O death, where is thy victory?" And that's what Jesus is doing. He is mocking the enemy. Just as the Lord, as the psalm tells us, he sits in heaven and he laughs at the nations. He holds them in derision. He mocks them as they plot in vain against the Lord's anointed. Likewise, in this scenario, the enemy has plotted in vain against this man born blind. The Lord's anointed. It says it anointed his eyes with mud. The enemy is plotting in vain against this man born blind because in just a moment, this man is about to be able to see with a new set of eyes. So Jesus, he's making fun of the blind, the enemy's tactics. Nice try, enemy. Nice try, blindness. Still yet, there's another important thing here I want us to see with the dirt and the mud. And that is that we have to die before we can be made new. We have to be buried before we can be resurrected. And so as Jesus takes dirt, spits in it, creates mud, puts it over the man's eyes, Jesus is, in some sense, he's burying this man, okay? He's putting him in the dirt. He's putting him under the dirt. And then he resurrects the man. He buries him in the dirt, and then he's resurrected. He's raised to life out of the baptismal waters as he goes and washes, if you will. And this is, of course, true for us. We have to die in order to be raised to life. We can't have resurrection without death first. Our flesh and our salvation, when we're brought from spiritual death to spiritual life, our flesh has to die. Our old man has to be put in the dirt so that we can be raised out of the grave and made into a new creation. You can't have resurrection without death. And resurrection is, it's like one of the best things about Christianity. It's the great hope and promise of the Christian faith that though Christ died, he did rise again, and so therefore we have confident hope that we're going to rise again. That death will be defeated, that we will not stay dead in the grave, but that we will rise again to eternal life. That is the great hope of Christianity. That's the whole point and end goal, that we'll be raised to life to glory in God forever. And the greatest part of our Christian faith, resurrection, cannot happen without death. It can't happen without our arch enemy. Isn't God such a great storyteller? That the greatest thing that we are promised and hopeful for happens out of the greatest conflict with our enemy. In order to have resurrection, we have to have death. That's why it's so important. That's why Christian funerals are so important. Because that is the greatest moment of our witness on this earth, as we are faced, those who are left, who are the dead, we're faced with the reality of death, and we remember the resurrection, that this had to happen so our brother or sister can be raised again. Not even with us, not just with us, not just with this man, but Jesus himself. The thing we celebrate the most, that he is alive today. He rose from the dead. Death couldn't hold him. He mocked the grave. He had to die first, though. He had to die so that he could be resurrected, so that we could be resurrected. So, of course, we talk about the Bible and we talk about Christ being the point of all Scripture. Really, the whole Bible is a great big story about death and resurrection. It's a great big story about death and resurrection. And that's what this story is about. That's what Jesus healing the man born blind with mud, washing in the water, is a story about death and resurrection. So in that way, it's a story about Jesus. Jesus is telling his own story in burying and resurrecting this man, and mocking the enemy with what he would soon do. When Jesus shows a little picture of death and resurrection of this man, he mocks the enemy by showing him, hey, I'm about to do this to you. I'm about to do this to you. The enemy probably isn't catching on. Satan's probably not realizing the little picture Jesus is trying to show him. He's not realizing Jesus is saying, I'm about to do this to you. I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise again. Death and resurrection is the story that's being told here. Because you do realize the way that death and the enemy is defeated is by death and resurrection. So Jesus, he mocks and he defeats the enemy by burying and raising this man. All the while showing the enemy how he's going to defeat the enemy and ultimately mock him. So Jesus, he does this crazy, weird, but really cool thing, spitting on the dirt, rubbing the mud on his eyes, and making him go wash. Verse 7, he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. Now, upon a face value reading of this passage, or just upon a surface level reading, many people might struggle a little bit in being perplexed about the mud and the washing in the pool. And it can be very easy that people in their own minds, they might give too much credit to the mud and the washing in the pool, or even too much credit to the man's obedience in going to the pool and washing, thinking that in some way these means that Jesus uses are somehow powerful in themselves. And that, of course, is taking things too far. That's not what's going on here. We have to recognize, how do we understand this then? We must recognize that this is actually the absurdness of mud being rubbed in the eyes, washing in the water, and that healing a man born blind, it's actually showing us the absurdity that mud or water could actually heal someone born blind. Okay? It's showing us the absurdity. It's not trying to give credit to the mud or the water or the man's obedience, but it's showing the absurdity of using mud and water to heal blindness. It's showing us that these are outrageous means that Jesus uses to show his own power, and that these means are indeed outrageous, and that the power is actually in Jesus and not in the means. While Jesus used means like his saliva, making mud, washing it in water, telling the man to go wash in the pool, it's clear that the healing power was not in the saliva, the mud, the water, or the man's obedience, but it was in Jesus Christ himself. It's very interesting that Jesus tells the man to go wash in the water for healing. You know, one of the things that we need to remember when we read the Bible is when we see something in the Bible that we've seen before in the Bible in another place, when we see things that are repeated in the Bible, it ought to bring back to our mind those other instances where it happened. And maybe think about, okay, is there a connection the Bible's trying to show you between these two different events that are similar? For example, there is a pretty rich biblical tradition of people being washed in water and having their sickness healed, or whatever it is. We saw this back in John chapter 5. Jesus is there with the invalid man, and the invalid tells Jesus, you know, I can't go down to the pool of Bethesda and get the water because everyone leads me there, and no one can take me into the water. So we talked about how there is this tradition that people would go to the waters of Bethesda for physical healing of things. But this man in John 5 who Jesus healed couldn't make it into the water, so Jesus heals him miraculously right there. But there's this tradition that we see of people washing in the water to receive a physical healing. We think as well of the symbolism we have in baptism, that when we are buried in the water, we're raised to newness of life, so our sins are symbolically washed away there in the water. It's showing us what happens to us in regeneration. And also, I think of one other specific story I want to mention to you that might be coming to our minds if we think about this idea of washing in the water. In 2 Kings chapter 5, there was this guy who was a commander of the Syrian army named Naaman, was his name. And the Lord actually gave the Syrian army commander victory in various battles. However, this commander had leprosy. He had a bad case of leprosy, and of course leprosy was a terribly unclean disease. There's a lot of laws in the Old Testament surrounding what you're to do if you had leprosy. Very unclean disease. And it just so happened that during one of the Syrian raids, they captured some Israelites, and they captured a little Israelite girl. Obviously a tragic thing, but they captured this little girl, and this girl, she sees that the commander of the army has leprosy, and she tells everybody, hey, there's this guy in Israel, there's a prophet in Israel, who if you go to him, he can heal this guy, which that's a fun story we should come to one day. And lo and behold, word gets around to Naaman, and he actually believes that the little girl, there's a prophet in Israel who could heal his leprosy. And so he goes, and long story short, it's the prophet Elisha, and he gives word to Naaman that he needs to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River, and he'll be healed of his leprosy. And the guy, he thinks it's a joke, and he's like, oh, I'm not doing that. And these people convince him to, and he ends up going, and he washes the Jordan River 7 times, and just as Elisha said, he was healed from his leprosy. And he washes, there's the theme I want you to see that connects us with John chapter 9. He washes, and he's made clean, and he has his skin restored. He ends up doing what Elisha said. Behold, he's healed. He was made a new creation, as it were. So here in John 9, Jesus heals something that's even more impossible to heal than leprosy. Because there was hope that leprosy would be healed. Because they had regulations to follow. If you were healed, you had to go get checked out, you had to do all these different things. So there was, leprosy was a skin disease that could potentially be healed. Elisha heals it in Naaman. But here in John 9, Jesus heals something that is more impossible to heal than leprosy. He heals not a disease, not a skin sickness or skin disease, but he heals a physical birth defect of eyes that don't work, blindness. And he does so with a greater ease than how Elisha did. He doesn't have to go to the Jordan to wash 7 times, but he just puts some mud on his eyes and tells him to go wash it off. And he sees. So in some sense here, Jesus is showing himself to be the greater prophet, or greater Elisha. But one thing that we must know is that this miracle is not just a miracle. It's a miracle that's not just a miracle, like all miracles, not just miracles. But it was a sign that Jesus was and is the Christ, the Son of God. More specifically, this miracle of giving sight to the blind was not just, a good deed or something to help out a poor person or an act of kindness, but it was a sign that Jesus was and is the messianic light of the world that he said that he was. He was literally shining light in this man's darkness. It's not merely a good deed or act of mercy to a poor man. It was the revealing of who he was. Jesus wasn't just giving this man sight. He was revealing who he was. He was giving others sight to who he was. In giving this man physical sight, he gives others spiritual sight into who he was and is. And this is the purpose, the ultimate purpose, for us having this passage in Scripture reading preserved for us today, that who Jesus is, what he's done, who he is, that would be revealed to us today so that we might believe, so that we can read about this miracle and have our eyes opened by God's Spirit and see Jesus really is the Son of God. Jesus really is the Christ. He really is the light of the world that sheds our spiritual darkness and gives us new eyes and makes us new creations so that we might believe in him and have faith. John says toward the end of his gospel that he's writing these things, meaning his entire gospel. He has written these things so that you may believe. That's his whole point of the gospel. So that you may believe. And that's what this is for. That Jesus would be revealed to us. And that you would believe in him. That you would see him for who he is. And believe that he is the Son of God and the light of the world. When we think about the spiritual picture of salvation here, we must recognize what it was that Jesus did. Jesus totally transformed this man. He totally transformed this man. He took his defective set of eyes and he made him into a new set of eyes that could now see. And what we see here is that the work of salvation is not just getting zapped to heaven when you die. It is a work of total transformation. Jesus gives us a new heart for the purpose of desiring new things, things that we couldn't desire before. Jesus gives us new eyes to see new things, or to see things more beautifully, or to see sin now as ugly and terrible and awful, and to see Christ and the Word of God as beautiful and as life-giving and as precious to us. He gives us new ears to hear new things we couldn't hear before. He totally transforms us and remakes us into totally new creatures. So that we're not the same as we were before. We're not the same. We are demonstrably different. And you'll see that when this man goes and he visits the Pharisees and the people who are like, are you sure this was the man who was blind? He totally transforms. eye-opening, two last things. The eye-opening was a work of sovereign grace. It's clearly what we see from beginning to end. It was all of grace. Jesus saw the man on his own initiative, when the man did not see him. Jesus, without any force or any invitation even, approached the man and healed the man. And he did it without any assistance from the man or anyone else. It was all of grace. And so it is the work of grace in our hearts, the spiritual light to our spiritual eyes. From beginning to end, all of grace. God sees us. He looks upon us in compassion and mercy. He comes to us without our force, without our invitation, and he heals us without any of our assistance. It is all of grace. Finally and secondly, the eye-opening, of course, is for the glory of God. That is why it is all of grace, that God can be glorified and receive all the glory. Not that we can, so that we might not boast of anything in ourselves. Oh, look at us and how we went to the pool and washed ourselves off. No, it is all for the glory of God. It should show us the means that God uses, the absurdity that the means are powerful in themselves. That God alone is the one powerful to save and make new. The man born blind was in a most helpless situation. He was in the most helpless situation, blind from birth, not even knowing, ignorant of what he should look for. And you see, that is the best situation to be in. To be in the most helpless situation is the best situation to be in, because that is for whom Jesus came. That is where he goes in the most helpless situations. He came to heal the most helpless. Utterly helpless people can be totally saved people. Utterly helpless people can be totally saved people. Are you an utterly helpless person today? The good news is that Jesus can totally save you.